Well, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for putting together a really good program. And also the opportunity to present in front of an esteemed group of compensation researchers and labor finance researchers as well. So thank you. This paper is co-authored with John Bijak, Ju Ren, and Brian Young, who are all in the audience today. So since this paper is about RPE, relative performance evaluation, I think it's integral to what we do in this paper. I think it's useful to start off with a picture that resembles what Matthew presented. So I guess we should have shared our slides before we presented our work. It's very similar to what he showed. If you go back to like the beginning of our sample period, 2007, RPEs were used by about 20% of the firms in our sample. And by the time we reach the end of our sample, which is 21, there is a threefold increase in the usage of RPE. So it's about 60% or so. Now, what is masked in this are some nuances, such as how critical RPE is to the average CEO's compensation, how deep these awards run, who it covers, and the persistence of usage by a firm over the time period. So those are all important as well that this picture does not display. But the point is that these are pretty common, very ubiquitous form of compensation that we need to actually start paying attention to. Now, if I zoom in to one of these RPE awards, again, something that Matthew briefly discussed yesterday, but this is crucial for our study, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this. This is what a modern day RPE looks like. It comes from Air Products 2018 grant to the CEO. The grant was essentially $6 million, and the total compensation that year was $13 million. So it's roughly half of the CEO's compensation. So it's a pretty big deal. Now, as Matthew pointed out, these are rank order tournaments. So we take the peer group, which is a bespoke peer group that is selected by the board and the compensation committee and the consultants. And they have about 14 firms, including the focal firm, in this RPE sort of peer group, right? We call it sort of the custom peer group. Now, Air Products is an industrial gas manufacturer, so it's sort of natural to think about industrial chemical firms included in this peer group, and that's exactly what you find. Now, there is a mapping function that maps essentially the percentile ranking, so you see what the rank is in 3 years, and where Air Products stands in this peer group, and convert the rank into what is called a percentile ranking. And that ranking maps into the payout. So think of the target as essentially 100%. So that's about 31,000 shares. If you are above the target, which is essentially above that dot there, you are going to get more than 100% of the target payout. And it caps out essentially at the 75th percentile. So you get essentially twice the 31,000 shares. And if you are at the threshold, essentially you are going to be at 30 percentile. 30th, you got to be at least at the 30th percentile. If you're below that, of course, you get nothing, right? So this is coming from the grant proxy year filing. And this has been studied before, including some prior papers on RPE. What is now somewhat new is that firms are telling us exactly what how they perform. So if you sort of move forward 3 years into the 20 fiscal year disclosure, then what you find is the Air Products is telling us how they did. And so the TSR, which is the metric, the total stockholder return, was 115% over the 3 years, very impressive. And Air Products was essentially the second ranked in this peer group. So if you convert the rank into a percentile, you get 92nd percentile. Now, this is critical for what we do. So what we do is we take that 92nd percentile as a proportion of the target, which is the median, which gives us 1.84 times essentially the target performance, right? So this is lots of firms are telling us, announcing to us how they did vis-a-vis the original grant. And that is something that we leverage in this paper to ask the questions that we are chasing. So this brings me to the motivation for this paper, what we do. There has been an increase in the use of performance vesting awards, and RP is a kind of a performance vesting award, or what we call PV awards. And this has been driven by multiple factors. It's beyond the scope of what I'm doing here, but briefly, it's been driven by institutions, proxy advisors, shareholders, all demanding sort of more accountability for the CEOs. And so firms have sort of responded to that pressure, and there's more incorporation of these PV awards into these plans. And I have a couple of papers with John Carr Bettis and Jeff Coles on on sort of like this evolution and the incentive properties of these awards. And Lee and Wang have a paper as well. Now, one of the appealing aspects of this is that it's very objective. It's incentive driven, it's formula based, right? So everybody can sort of evaluate how the CEO is doing. And naturally, there's sort of like a lot of adoption of these awards. But one of the downsides to having objective measures is that CEOs are going to try everything they can to meet those objective benchmarks. And this leads us into sort of this literature on managerial myopia, where they're trying to hit exactly what the boards ask them to do. And this has been sort of, this question has been asked when it comes to absolute performance awards. So what we're doing is relative performance awards. So now it's related. So we say, okay, RPs are a big deal. So let's sort of dig into this contract, which seems to be a pretty significant part of a CEO's compensation. But the crucial thing is, unlike an absolute performance award, relative performance awards are essentially, benchmarked to peers. And unlike sort of hitting the benchmarks where you can control your own performance, it's very hard to control peer performance, right? So it's sort of interesting and natural to ask what we observe in these awards. So a few things we do. First, we ask, are there strange patterns in terms of clustering of performance, which are relative, not absolute, around these contractual benchmarks? And then we create sort of a counterfactual exercise where we say, what would a typical RP outcome look like for some representative firm? And can we benchmark that to that and see if there are deviations from what we think that distribution should look like? And not just that, we leverage some of the contractual features of the RP award to see, does it show up in places where we expect it to show up? And the last thing we do, we sort of move one more step and say, can we put a monetary number to it? What are the value implications? In other words, if these are clustering around these important contractual benchmarks, which we sort of argue is discretion, what's the dollar value of this discretion to CEOs in our sample? And two, what are the incentive effects associated with it? Do they strengthen? Do they weaken? Or is there no incentive effect? So this is kind of our paper. Now, I don't know if I would have the time to discuss all the literature on RP. It's going to be nearly impossible. And a lot of people have already mentioned Holmstrom a few times, so I won't do that. So the essential idea is, people are sort of, you're contracting on something. There's a lot of variability that things managers can't control. And so if you reduce that variability, it improves risk sharing. And then, of course, through the informativeness principle, you're contracting on things that are very valuable for us to learn about the CEO's actions or efforts. And so Holmstrom had this elegant model. There was a first wave of RP papers that essentially showed nothing. They were struggling to find RP except maybe the Givens and Murphy paper. And then the second wave of papers, including Dirk's work in the context of CEO turnovers, and trying to sort of have nuanced measures of peers, sort of found some evidence of RPE. Dirk's paper shows that there's actually some puzzling aspects there with CEO turnover. There's the opposite of RPE. And then there are some newer papers that have leveraged this peer group that I mentioned, right? So let's dig deeper into what these peers look like to ask related questions that may be of interest to finance or accounting audience. And in that vein, there are a few papers that are related. So Matthew's work belongs somewhere here in terms of peer harming disclosures. And I didn't include yesterday's paper, so we will probably cite that too soon. I wasn't aware of it until the NBER program. There's some literature on risk-taking, how the peer group influences the firm's idiosyncratic risk. And then there's this paper on earnings release, like do firms behave strategically in relation to their peers of when they sort of announce their earnings so they can essentially get a higher payout. And then there is this absolute performance awards, which Ben, my new colleague at TCU, has as a paper in JFE, very well cited paper that shows clustering of performance, but those were based on absolute performance awards. And there's another paper by Atanasov et al. That looks at ex post, something that we are doing in this paper, but mainly relating to absolute performance. And I thank Yong for bringing up those two papers on discretion, use of discretion. So that's definitely related to what we're doing as well. So back to what we're doing. So the data, we have incentive lab data is essentially the source of what we did. And John and I, with Jeff Coles and Carr Bettis, were formerly it used to be called the Fathom Labs. So we were involved in the original development of this data, incentive lab, which is now part of ISS. So we go back to our incentive lab database. and look at contracts that were granted from 2007 to 2021. And we get the full details of the RP awards. If you go back to the picture, the Air Products example, we have essentially data on the peers, the functional form, the payout, the target, everything, right? So what they are telling ex ante in the contract. And that's not new. People have used that. So what is new is this data set. So we have the ex post, what I showed you, the next figure, 3 years from the grant, what they're telling us, how they did. And this is, we got this from Incentive Lab. I think it's new, but may not be new, I guess, over time. So we were fortunate to get our hands on that data. It's very comprehensive. And one of the cool aspects of that data is it's got the grant identifier, so I can link ex post disclosures to the original grant. And so we do that. And the crucial measure here is the percentage of the target. Like, what are they reporting in terms of the percentile as a percentage of what was specified for them to meet the target? Going back to the Air Products, I'll come back to that. It's 1.84. So the 92nd percentile as a percentage of the 50th of the median performance, right? So we have that data. And so when we match these two, we require that we can link them to the grant data. So we have about 10,000 contracts. So it's pretty big. So we start off with this hypothetical sort of it's nothing surprising here. So we go through a Monte Carlo simulation. So we take essentially the focal firm. It's a GBM process for the stock, for the focal firm and the peer firms. We have some assumptions about the drift, the volatility, and the variance covariance matrix. We embed all these things and say 3 years out, what's going to be the outcome, right? So we have 10,000 trials, and we have 16 firms in this example, including the RPE firm. So naturally, you're going to have something that resembles a uniform distribution with about 600 outcomes in each of those trials, right? So we have about 600 firms in each of those buckets of ranks. And so importantly, we don't obviously expect to see any clustering, right? So these are equally likely in each of these bins, and this is kind of what the distribution looks like. Now, this exercise ignores any strategic actions by the firm, including something that we saw yesterday, what firms might do to influence the outcome or get incentivized, or strategic actions they may take. Now, I came across an interesting article by Aon that provides us with some insights for the source of discretion or the channels that the boards there are, or choices that they may be confronted with that might sort of influence what ends up happening, right? So there are a few. So one, there's something called an open peer group versus a closed group. Are you using the ones that was originally specified, or are you using the ones that are currently available, right? So that is open versus closed. Lost peers, I mean, bankruptcy is easy to deal with, but how about like an M&A event, right? So do you take out the target from your peer group, or are you assigning the acquirer's returns to the peer group? That's an important decision. What about international firms, right? Are you accounting for domestic home currency or sort of US dollar returns? What about trading days? Are they using trading days versus calendar days? And if you're in different countries, that could make a big change. And the last thing is the small peer groups, right? So if you have a small peer groups, some percentile rankings are just infeasible, just because you won't have this nice sort of continuity in these rankings. And so this opens up the door for choices that the boards may make that we don't observe, because they never tell us what they are. We just don't know. And this gets me to the main finding in our paper, right? So we are essentially doing a density estimate. This is McCrary 2008. And we have a histogram, and we are smoothing out the histogram using some bandwidth around sort of this cutoff. So the running variable is the reported percentile as a percentage of the target. And we are essentially looking at the left and the right. These are log density estimates. So we are taking essentially the difference between those two. And if there is no discontinuity, it has to be a smooth line. And if there is one, there's going to be a big jump there, right? So this is relative performance, right? Not absolute. And so what we find is sort of interesting. We find that these estimates are it's discontinuous at the target. And if you convert sort of these log into numbers that we can sort of understand, we find 3 times as many observations at or above, just above the target, relative to just below the target, right, in the percentile ranking. So this seems pretty interesting. Now the question is, can we pull sort of leverage the data and contractual terms to see where it shows up more? The first thing we do is the peer group type. So this is an important distinction. Over 60% or 60 or maybe more is essentially what I showed you before, custom peer group. And then there is the market, such as the S&P 500, and the industry, such as a transportation index, right? So that's the remaining 35% or so. And what's unique about the custom peer group is that you have mostly the competitors. So it's important for you to sort of like show to the market that you're actually at least at the median, right? So we expect the effects likely to be stronger there. And also, if at all there is discretion that is being used, it's easier to move one peer rather than an index where the effects are going to be more continuous. So the effects are going to be much stronger when you have sort of a smaller peer group. And we find that these estimates are bigger when we use these smaller sort of like bespoke custom peer group. And we use the methodology that was newly proposed by Baisulov and Basu 2019 JE paper to sort of compare these estimates across these three. And we show that the effects are significantly higher with custom peer groups. The other one is stock return versus accounting metric, right? So accounting metric, you can do a lot of crazy things. I mean, you can exclude things that are not GAAP related. You know, you can sort of not count certain items. And so discretion could be really important there. And we find precisely that. It doesn't show up. There is discontinuity in both the underlying metrics, but it's larger with accounting awards. The next thing we ask is this thing that I don't think a lot of people sort of have dealt with in the literature, which is interpolation. This is a big deal when it comes to payout. If you don't have interpolation, and if you go back to the picture I showed you before, if the firm is below the target, if there is no interpolation, you're going to be given sort of the threshold level of payout. But if you linear interpolate between the threshold and the max, it's not that big a deal because even if you're not at the 50th percentile, you're going to get something closer, right? And 20% of the awards are actually don't have any interpolation. And we find that the discontinuity estimates are actually larger there, right? Where the stakes are bigger. Related to this, the idea of concavity. So do I have more to lose if I don't hit it versus not getting rewarded as much if I outperform that, right? So this is the idea of concavity. And we find one of the ways to measure concavity is cash versus equity. If you have an equity award, the underlying metric is returns, and the payout is also returns price. And so it's multiplicative, right? It's convex. But cash is less convex. It's actually more concave. And so we find that when there is more to lose if you don't hit it versus not gaining a lot, if you overperform, the incentives are bigger. So we find this more with cash awards. And similarly, the two other contractual benchmarks that I didn't talk about, which is the threshold and the max. At the threshold, there's a lot riding there. If you don't hit it, you're going to be essentially at zero. And the max, when you outperform, it doesn't get you anything. It's just capped. And so these are regions of concavity, and we find that it's there in those two benchmarks as well. And the last thing I'm going to show you with discontinuity is our effort to mimic what the firm is reporting. So we have data on the returns, we have data on the peers, we know what performance period the firm is specifying. And so we can perform this experiment ourselves. So we take the grant, we go to the end, we rank them all together, and we find essentially that the effects are generally weaker. So there is some discontinuity. I don't think we can dismiss that, right? So there is some discontinuity, but we don't find the effects as large as what firms are reporting to us, right? Now that could mean that there are both these channels that are going on where firms are trying their level best to actually be at or above the target. And they are to some extent successful, as we show in our event study results in our paper. So we can't rule that out. But there is this other element that is also seems to be going on, and perhaps we have to do more work to show how it's coming about, is the use of board's discretion relating to some of the ideas that I showed you before with the Aon paper, right? So there are some choices that the boards are making that we can't observe that seems to actually lead to sort of like this big pop at the end. And how much time do I have? 5 minutes, maybe? Okay. All right, I think it's perfect. So now the last thing I'm going to do is show you sort of the value and the incentive implications of what the discontinuity really means. So what we do here is we take that simulation approach to our data. We have thousands and thousands of observations, and we have our methodology. So we ask the question, what if we gave the benefit of the doubt to the CEO? This is kind of like getting really close to the target. And we have this baseline where we don't give that benefit of the doubt. We don't do anything, right? So that would resemble sort of what that distribution I showed you before. That's like our baseline. And I'm going to bump the CEO up to the target within a certain percentile point. So we're doing either 5 or 10. It doesn't matter what we do here. So we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. So if they are at the 48th percentile, we're going to move them to the target. But if they are at the 40th percentile, for this first set of results, we don't move them. So what you see here are summary stats on those observations where we moved them, right? Gave them the benefit of the doubt. And what we show here is the change in value, right? How much this means to the average CEO. And if we move them to the threshold, naturally there's a big monetary effect, right? It's close to $1 million. And if we did the same thing to the target, we have an increase of about 10%, right? Relative to what would be the case if they were not sort of bumped up, right? So that seems big to us. And with max threshold, these are the 3 contractual benchmarks, we find the effect is about 5%, right? So by and large, the takeaway is that if at all these guys are clustering by whatever actions that the boards are taking, these are very important numbers. These are very meaningful. Well, what do they do to incentives? Well, we repeat the same thing, except we introduce what is called the RPE delta. So we introduce this measure in one of our older papers where we increase the focal firm returns by 1%, keep everybody else the same, and then essentially look at sort of the monetary effect at the end and versus the one without the 1% perturbation. So similar to what the literature has sort of defined as delta. And relative to the case where you have essentially no bumping going on, the delta essentially declines marginally. And the idea is that absent the discretion, the managers would have done something to get there, maybe through effort. And by including discretion, you're sort of blunting that effect here, right? So it sort of diminishes incentives. Or at worst, at best, it doesn't seem to impact incentives. So big value change, no incentive effects that we observe. In conclusion, so we are sort of tackling this increasing adoption of RP by US firms. We have a new and unique database that has information on what firms are reporting in vis-a-vis what they granted. So we find patterns that seems to be sort of interesting, and I would even argue it's striking because you can influence the peers, but it's hard. So that sort of prompts a lot of questions. So two stories. Firms are potentially manipulating the performance at the performance end period, but boards are using choices that we don't observe to sort of get them there. Now, in terms of conclusion, I think I go back to Peter's comment in the previous paper. How it calls into question how we sort of define, like how we measure value and incentives. Here we are running all our fancy delta and vega estimates, assuming there are these contracts. But if somehow these things are changed, exposed, it presents a challenge to all of us, right? How we capture that. So that's the paper. Thank you.